since 2011, thanks to Nicolas Sarkozy and thanks to, I hate to say it, Barack Obama. I mean, this was a classical war for oil. Classical. So first Iraq, then Libya, and now Venezuela. But again, you have the corporate media misinforming the population, trying to make it palatable that regime change in Venezuela means human rights, means advancing human
Yeah,
rights.
you've called out a lot the corporate media, but let's also not leave out a lot of left-leaning outlets and a lot of left-leaning organizations. I've also jumped the shark on Libya, throwing Julian Assange under the bus, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Syria, and that leads to what to my second to last question then with you is you've actually spoken out on the war in Syria and the efforts to oust Assad. So that said, can you explain why legally Russia was right at the invitation of the Assad government to come into Libya to defeat these Western Gulf-backed Islamists like ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, in order to in order to protect the sovereignty of the Syrian government and to avoid a worse humanitarian catastrophe, which would be if the Saudi, Qatari, Western-backed thugs in Syria were to overthrow Assad?
Well, first of all, I have no sympathy for Assad. I had no sympathy for Gaddafi. I had no sympathy for Saddam Hussein or for Mr. Maduro. I am a professor of international law, and I like to apply international law uniformly, not selectively. And international law says that when there is a civil war, the international law of neutrality requires that you do not interfere in the civil war. The only exception to that rule is that the government in power, in this case Assad, does have the right to request assistance from another state, in that case Russia. So Russia is there by invitation of the Assad government, which under classical international law is the only way in which a third party can assist, participate in this war. So Russia is legally in Syria. The United States is illegally in Syria. The European states are illegally supporting the
non-existent moderate rebels.
well, but they also supported the Al-Nusra and the other terrorists, and Saudi Arabia, of course, which is itself a terrorist state. But what should be remembered here is that Russia has withdrawn quite a bit of its forces. Russia provided critical help in a critical moment. And if there was any goodwill in Europe, they would have wrapped this up long ago, because the prolongation of this tragedy of the Syrian people is a direct result of the Europeans financing the opposition, which is illegal. The 1985-1986 judgments of the International Court of Justice in the military and paramilitary interventions of the United States in Nicaragua. That was the Nicaragua judgments. Clearly condemned the United States financing and supporting the Contras in Nicaragua against the government of Daniel Ortega. This was a criminal act, and this was an illegal act on the part of Washington. You cannot support a revolution in another country. This violates the United Nations Charter. This also violates specifically Resolution 2625 of the General Assembly, that is the Friendly Relations Resolution of November 1970. And it also violates Resolution 3314 of the General Assembly, the 1974 definition of aggression. It was cited by the International Court of Justice and in the judgment in Nicaragua as a violation of both resolutions 2625 and 3314. The same thing applies in Syria. So
the clear war crime that took place, which was aggressive war, which entails all of the other evils that come with it, which the U.S. and its allies did on the democratic socialist government of Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista government in the 80s, where they supported with drug money on top of that the Contras war. So you compare what's going on in Syria, the Western Gulf War there, to that epic war crime of the 1980s, the Contras war.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the parallels are all there, and the same principles of international law that were validated by the International Court of Justice in the judgment against the United States would apply if we had today a judgment concerning the involvement of Europe, of Israel, of Saudi Arabia in the war in Syria. They would all be condemned. But then what should follow? I mean, there should be consequences when there is an international wrongful act. You should have some consequences, both legal, penal, civil reparation. I think that the Europeans are obliged to reconstruct the country.
Yeah.
The Europeans have participated in the destruction of the infrastructures of Syria. Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States have committed crime against crime. I would like to see a good part of the crimes committed by the al-Nusra movement, by the ISIS movement, by Daesh, by the terrorists, but also by Saudi Arabia, Israel, United States, etc., before the International Criminal Court, because we have had here the crime of aggression, Article 5 of the Rome Statute. You could even say genocide, Article 6.
Oh, there has been genocide in Syria. It's not Assad that's been doing it. It's been the Western Gulf-backed thugs.
No, it is baffling, but in order to get there, you need conviction on the part of the intellectual classes of France and Italy and Germany and the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, the media in these countries are not doing their job. The media in these countries have been disseminating fake news and suppressing true information. And one of
Do
the
you
things that,
do you include the NGOs in that, like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, which has also been leading the dissemination of propaganda against the Venezuelan government, against the Nicaraguan government, which is going through a repeat of 1980, and Syria. I mean, I spoke with one of the heads of of Amnesty International UK, and they were at the Labour Party conference when Jeremy Corbyn was still the leader. It was his last party conference as leader, and I confronted them, but in a very polite Gandhian manner, because they were talking about human rights this, human rights that, what was going on in Yemen, the Western Gulf-backed war there, and I asked the question. I said, you talk a lot about human rights, and you mentioned the Western Gulf-backed war in Yemen. Well, how come you're not condemning? How come, however, you're not condemning the Western Gulf-backed war in Syria, in which the West and the Gulf states funded ISIS and all of the other Islamist groups in an effort to overthrow the Syrian government? And I also mentioned, the Western-backed, the violation of, of Venezuela's sovereignty and their human rights when the West backed the Western, oligarchic movement in Venezuela. I was applauded for that, and I was told, privately, thanks for, asking that question. But Amnesty used the neutrality card. They used the neutrality card and said, well, all sides have committed human rights abuses, therefore we're neutral, and we want a peaceful a peaceful resolution and all of that.
you
And
know,
they also said that Julian Assange
Yuri,
was not a prisoner of
uh,
con. They also
I,
said that Julian Assange was not a political a prisoner of conscience.
I'm glad to hear that because I made the same experience as you have. And if you think Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are deficient in their defense of human rights globally, if you think that they're being selective, if you think that they're not being professional, I can confirm that from 40 years of experience. But of course, their worry is money, of course, donors. If they say what they ought to say, if they were really committed to human rights, then donations. I'm not saying donations from the US government or from the UK government. I'm saying donations from individuals who are just as manipulated as everybody else, who are just as disinformed as everybody else, or who are uh, corporations that have solid economic interests at stake. Those donations are going to dry up. So they are being political. They are being careful. That's how come they weaponize human rights against certain countries. They weaponize human rights against Maduro, against Assad, against Gaddafi. They are the bad guys. And of course, they get a lot of applause for doing that. And then they get donations. So that's the name of the game. But certainly Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are not the worst among the NGOs. I can give you dozens of others, including the so-called International Service for Human Rights. It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. And that, as I say, I have been for more than 40 years involved in human rights matters. I was certainly a human rights expert when I was an assistant at the University of Göttingen, later at the University of Heidelberg. My 25 years with the United Nations as a staff member. I've also been president of the Pen Club here in Switzerland, in Swiss Romand. from 2006 to 2009, and again from 2013 to 2017. So I've been president of a non-governmental organization. I've had to deal with other non-governmental organizations. I've been professor of law for decades. And I tell you, my experience is that these non-governmental organizations are not doing their job professionally.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well,
one point, because I have to end.
Yeah.
We were talking about Saddam Hussein. We're also talking about Assad. Uh, One of the things that shocks me the most in the international system is the failure of the so-called watchdogs, like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, to
yes.
do their work professionally, ethically, objectively. The scandal that you have an organization like the
OPCW
manipulating the reports of its own investigators. It's, well, what is left when you cannot even trust an organization that has been established precisely to act as a watchdog, and it acts as an arm of Washington, or as an arm of NATO, or as an arm of the European Union? I mean, it is a disgrace. And they've been caught with their pants down. And here, the mainstream media has covered it up.
Well, same with what my previous guest on the show, Chris Marsden of the Socialist Equality Party and a contributor to the World Socialist website. Same with the pseudo left. Many left-leaning outlets, left-leaning organizations have also, for whatever reason, have also jumped the shark on, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, throwing Julian Assange under the bus, as well as supporting, the war for oil in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia. And it's just unbelievable.
Well, I have seen that. I will not name names because I don't want to hurt people. But I have seen a number of left-leaning intellectuals betray the ethics of all their work, basically, by saying things that are demonstrably wrong, and suppressing information that is in the public domain, which they know, but doesn't fit their purpose in that particular context. And if I take the United Nations system, you will see it in my report concerning Venezuela. I have a long footnote concerning a study by the United Nations on the impact of sanctions in Syria. The report, I have it. It has been withdrawn. The United Nations was put under such pressure by the United States that it actually withdrew the report. But once a report gets a number, and once a report is put on the internet, you cannot undo it because someone has already copied it. And that's what happened. The Intercept, Glenn Griswold, put it up on its site. And that adds insult to injury when you realize that the United Nations itself withdraws a solid report because the donors, the United States and others, don't want that report to be known. They don't want to know that their criminal sanctions policies are killing people in Syria. So go on my report, check Syria, check the intercept, and you will see how even the United Nations Secretariat, can manipulate human rights and can engage in the same kind of weaponization of human rights against the enemies of neoliberalism and completely suppress information that shows the crimes of those very neoliberal governments in Washington, in Ottawa,
Yeah,
in
and
London.
that's interesting that the Intercept would report that, because the Intercept has also been quite, you know, Assad must go, and you know, and regurgitating a lot of the propaganda. So that's interesting that Glenn Greenwald would publish that suppressed reports.
Yeah, I mean it's well, that was then. I mean, I'm talking about something that was suppressed in 2016, I think, and Glenn brought it, I think, 2017, and that's how come I was able to cite it. But I can name you several examples of the United Nations pulling out reports. There was a report by my good friend and former colleague, Professor Richard Falk, together with Virginia Tilley.
Yeah.
Tilley. They had a report concerning Gaza, and that was also pulled. So you have to be quite, shall we say, circumspect whenever you approach the United Nations or a particular agency of the United Nations and they're doing something that seems weird, not consistent with their mandate. Ask the question, cui bono? Who is benefiting from this? And that might then explain what they're doing, because they may be the targets of blackmail. They may be the targets of really strong-armed policies. And if I do publish my book, and I've started writing a book called The Human Rights Industry. And the book, The Human
Fantastic.
Rights Industry, is going to show
Well,
how.
thank you for announcing on 1+1, and we're definitely going to have to get you back on for that.
Well, let me use this opportunity to ask viewers to send me instances that they are aware of this kind of unethical behavior by non-governmental organizations, by national human rights institutions, by United Nations officials, etc., to show that unfortunately there is no saint in the system that you can believe in. Be happy that you get certain amount of information which you can use to build upon to try to make a better society. But don't think that the United Nations or the High Commissioner for Human Rights or the High Commissioner for Refugees are all wonderful people. They are like you and me. There's good in the bad, there's bad in the good. And you have to put it into context and see what does it mean here in this particular situation? What are the implications? And then I would like to, as I say, address your viewers with a call not to give up, a call to persevere, a call to demonstrate, to write, in the same sense that the late Stefan Hessel, whom I had the honor of knowing, Stefan Hessel published in the year 2011 a little booklet called Indignez-vous, Be Indignant. And I thought that that book was fabulous because it meant we shouldn't be just sitting on our rear ends and saying, blah, 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 and banalities. What is important is that we take our responsibility as citizens, and our civic duty is to demand that human rights be respected. Not only to talk about it among our friends, but to demand it of government. And when government doesn't do it, to protest and to send individual complaints to the Human Rights Committee, to send individual complaints to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, to send individual complaints to the African Commission and Court of Human Rights, etc. We simply have to become mobilized. We are empowered, we have the rights, but we're not using them. And on this happy note, I think I will leave you because my wife is signaling to me it's lunchtime. Yeah. Okay. We'll
All
be
right.
in touch.
Well, on that, yes, on that note, I remember what the great Ralph Nader, the best U.S. president, 3 times that we never had, once said, breaking through power, it's easier than you think. And so, Mr. Zayas, thank you so much for joining us on 1+1. And actually, and then before I end, I actually want to invite you back on again very soon at whatever time is most convenient to you, because we didn't get to my fifth number one question, which I want my fifth question I wanted to ask you, which is about indigenous rights.
We'll do it, and I have a lot on indigenous, and my heart goes out to them. I refer to my report to the General Assembly back in 2013, and paragraph 69, little n. That is the paragraph in which I say that all peoples denied their self-determination, all peoples under occupation, all peoples under subjugation, notably the indigenous, they must petition the United Nations to vindicate Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the article that guarantees the right of all peoples, not some peoples, all peoples, the right of self-determination, not the right to self-determination sometime in Never Never Land, the right of self-determination today. So on this happy note,
exactly, and so
we can do it in 2 weeks or so, because there's a lot happening in the indigenous world.
Perfect. It would be an honor to do that. Until then, we were joined on 1+1 with Alfred Zayas, a fantastic diplomat, a fantastic former UN Special Rapporteur on sanctions, or however that lengthy title was, and a true truth teller and myth buster. This will be the first of many conversations. Enjoy your enjoy your lunch. I also have my own barbecue to get to at around 3. So, but thank you so much for joining us, and this will be the first of many conversations.
You send me the links as soon as you have it, and possibly you can do it in sections, because we've spoken so long that you can probably do 3 or 4 sessions out of it. Yeah.
And don't forget to send me the links also to your website and so forth, so if people want to continue to follow your work and your writings and also your books, they can go on those links.
We'll do so. Yeah. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.